Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues, better navigate the challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests for this 100th episode.
Hey.
With me are three of my stalwart recurring guests. Kimberly Davis is an author, TEDx speaker, and founder of the Brave Leadership University, leading development programs worldwide around authentic leadership, purpose, presence, and influence. Melissa Hughes is founder and principal of the Andrick Group, applying recent brain research to improve employee engagement, company culture, team dynamics, and innovation. And Peter Winick works with individuals and organizations to build and grow revenue streams through their thought leadership platforms, and is host of the Leveraging Thought Leadership podcast. Thank you all very much for being with me for this special episode.
Thanks for having us on. It's excited to be a part of this.
Congrats to 100 episodes.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
And here's our topic for today. This past June, a bill signed into law made Louisiana the only state requiring the 10 Commandments to be displayed in every classroom in public schools and colleges. Not surprisingly, civil liberty groups planned lawsuits to block the law, arguing it would unconstitutionally breach protections against government-imposed religion, unfairly and illegally eroding the constitutional barrier between religion and government. This is a dramatic reversal from 2003, when former Alabama Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore was ousted from the bench after disobeying a federal judge's order to remove a 5,000-pound granite monument of 10 Commandments displayed in the state court building. Baton Rouge Attorney General Liz Muriel commented that the 10 Commandments are pretty simple, but they also are important to our country's foundations. Research seems to back her up. Behaviorist Dan Ariely has reported that when students were asked to recount the 10 Commandments, they demonstrated less inclination to cheat, even though many of them couldn't name more than 2 of the commandments. A similar question arises almost every December over whether Christmas should be a national holiday. Objectors claim that it is a religious observance unjustly imposed on non-Christians, while defenders argue that it is part of our national heritage and part of the cultural fabric of our country. The late Senator Joe Lieberman remarked that the Constitution promises freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. Is it possible for us to acknowledge a cultural heritage built on religion while preserving the boundaries between church and state? The floor is open.
You know, it's so interesting to me because I think things like this wouldn't feel like such a big deal, except for fear, which is fear of setting precedent. And what does this mean moving forward? Because if it were just words on a piece of paper that were, that people refer to, that they used, that our country was founded on certain principles a long time ago, but we've got the separation of church and state, and this is just information. That's not that big of a deal. The big deal is what will people do with it moving forward? What does that mean for people of different faiths moving forward, and what precedent does it set?
Well, and I think, building on that, it's not what they are. I don't think there's a big community that says we should teach kids it's better to steal or to
right,
like
exactly,
the opposite,
exactly.
right? But it's where it comes from, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really if it was a general principle that said, hey, we want to teach kids some things, great. But where it comes from, I think, becomes the problem, where things, there's all sorts of things that were, I would say pure, but whatever, like somebody having an American flag on their car used to not mean a big thing. Now, you're hanging the flag upside down. Look at the justice, Supreme Court justices hanging a flag upside down. That says something. So is this the crossover drug to something else? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm down here in Florida, and in my particular county last year, there was a big brouhaha over a new group of school board officials who wanted to distribute Bibles with textbooks. And I had a problem with that. Not because I'm anti-Bible, so, but number one, are we going to teach the Bible in school? And if so, are we also going to teach the Quran? And are we also going to
Right.
teach the
Yes.
Torah? And so I mean, like, I think that there is a real difference between religious studies and indoctrination. And I think that I think we teach kids intolerance when we teach one. And we
I
see
agree.
that in book banning, right? We teach kids intolerance when we ban books that have anything to do with anything other than that ideal persona, right? Whatever that ideal is. And if you take all those offensive books off the shelves, then you're teaching one perspective. And I think that one perspective teaches intolerance. So do we want our kids to, do we want to teach tolerance? Because if we want to teach tolerance, then we got to teach a broad perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because you look at how much has changed since I was a kid a million years ago. And we used to do the Pledge of Allegiance in class, you know, one nation under God. And I never really thought about it. I mean, it's not language that I really paid much attention to be honest. And, you know, some people might think that's terrible, but it was just kind of memorized rote that we did. And so, you know, and we've got one nation under God on our currency. And so while all of this is definitely in violation of the separation of church and state, I think it's hard to argue that those are in violation of church and state. It's that they managed to sneak it in. And again, it's what will people do with it? What meaning will they make of this? Will they make the meaning that means your God is not as important as my God? You know, it's what human beings do to these things that give them power.
Well, it's kind of a lack of trust, isn't it? I mean, it's funny you mentioned the Pledge of Allegiance, because when I was an enlightened 12-year-old, and we said the Pledge of Allegiance, I would quietly censor myself. One, I didn't believe in God at that point in my life, so I admitted that, and I didn't like the idea of pledging allegiance to a flag. I was perfectly happy to pledge allegiance to the country.
Yeah.
So I would censor out parts of the, you know, when I got a few years older and a little more enlightened, I realized the importance of symbols. But you know, any symbol or any principle can be hijacked, can be weaponized, and we sort of see that people take their ideas, their beliefs, and then they try to impose those on others, and that leads to this lack of trust. I think there's a lot of perception that the effort to remove the Ten Commandments was part of an ideological agenda. And now there's a backlash.
On both sides, absolutely.
Right.
But I think
it's
the
about
core
where.
of the problem.
Go ahead.
I think that's the core of the problem, is that we don't trust one another. We are not one nation. We are very much a divided people. And that division is fraught with mistrust. And then we look for, you know, we see what we look for. So if you see one person holding up the Ten Commandments, you think, well, they're against me because I don't believe that. Well, it may not be that, but we're so divided in the way we look at the world that it's both it's our strength and our greatest challenge that we are a nation of so many different backgrounds and faiths and belief systems.
But I want to build on something Jonathan said about sort of imposing your belief. So if you and I, Jonathan, were to meet for a cup of coffee, and your agenda was to impose a belief you had on me on pick a topic, doesn't matter. Cool, we're two adults. We could do that. We can agree to disagree or be civil or whatever. But in the context of a school, kids have to be in school. They don't have a choice. And if you were trying
Right.
to impose a belief on me that was offensive, I can say, that's offensive to me. I don't want to participate in this conversation or escalate it or end it. I can say, I'm gonna not engage. I'm not going to talk about this with you. I think you're ridiculous, or I don't believe the world is flat, whatever. But if you're a 7-year-old in school, and now the 10 Commandments are up there with the pictures of all the presidents or whatever the things that are in classrooms these days, that's a little bit different, and I think the far other side of that is, what are we doing in schools with kids identifying in the restrooms they want to use and all that, right? Like that's imposing somewhat of a belief system on folks that don't necessarily subscribe to it.
I think for me the slippery slope is one person's rightness creates somebody else's wrongness, right? Instead of us both having the freedom to choose our own right values, one set of values actually by default creates another set of values as wrong. And I think for me, that's the hard part, especially in education, because, we want kids to appreciate diversity and the differences in one another and kind of what makes this country so great. And yet what we're teaching them is there's one right and everything else is wrong. And I have a real problem with that. And I'm not saying that thing isn't right. What I'm saying is that thing isn't the only thing that's right. Right. So that Christian belief, that ideology is fine. I'm not even saying it's wrong. It can be right, but there can be all kinds of other religious rights as well. And I think what happens is that one kind of group says, if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong. If you don't believe with my right, then you're wrong, and you don't get rights to have your own beliefs. That's my problem. And I think we teach kids that when we impose the 10 Commandments, and I don't have anything wrong with that. I don't have a problem with the 10 Commandments, but when we impose things like that on kids, unless we say, hey, we're going to explore lots of things, like what are the basic tenets of Judaism? What are the basic tenets of, let's have a conversation about those, but we don't.
Right. Because
they will say, well, that's not school's job. That's not the purpose of education, to teach religion. Except for when.
Yeah, but by imposing the 10 Commandments, as opposed to saying, hey, we're going to teach kids comparative religion. I mean, I think as an undergrad comparative religion class, right? Here's the 3 big ones, and here's what they think, and here's what they have in common, and here's where they diverge, whatever. You could use the same public funds to teach that, but clearly that's not the agenda here, right?
Right.
The agenda here is, there's one lane, this is the lane we're going down.
That's what I'm saying. There's one right. There's one right group.
Right.
And everything else is not right. And I'm using the word right, and now I'm realizing kind of where that's going, and that's not about right. I mean correct. I mean accepted.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a challenge that, they come with a lot of challenges, but we want to give kids the fundamentals, which means we can't get into too much nuance too early. It was a mistake that I made early in my teaching career, teaching high school students and thinking that, well, I've learned all this wisdom and I can teach anybody anything. And I discovered, sometimes quite uncomfortably, that sometimes kids, even high school kids, are just not ready for certain ideas. They're too nuanced, they're too sophisticated, they don't have the background or the foundation, and I'm causing them damage by exposing them to ideas that they're not ready to really engage yet. And as you go down through the grades, it's one of the reasons why I never taught younger grades, because there's a specific talent to being able to present material on that level that's appropriate, that's foundational. And so you have to remove the nuance. When you have to remove the nuance, you start getting into more black and white, which is the opposite of what we are doing on the show.
Mhm.
And yet we're sort of stuck in that situation. We want to expose them to different ideas, but we don't want to expose them to all ideas, which means we have to make judgment calls about what we include, what we exclude. And that's going to upset some people. Why didn't you put this? Why are you teaching it that way?
Right. Right.
You can't necessarily quantify your answers.
But Jonathan, what does it mean? What does freedom of religion actually mean? So, I think if we teach the kids the amendments and how we got here, I mean, we got here for freedom of religion, right? That's
Right.
part of why we're here. That's the bedrock of our society and our country. And so how can you do both? Like, how can you post the 10 Commandments and teach freedom of religion when the 10 Commandments are the only religious thing posted in a school? And if you post it in a classroom, are we not inherently saying this is the thing, this is the right thing? I mean, are we telling kids that just by posting it, even if we don't have a conversation? So,
Well, and by extension of that, what happens when there's 1, 2, 3, a handful of kids in the class, and they go home, and that's not the belief system taught in their class? They're Muslim, they're atheist, whatever. Like, okay, that's not particularly inclusive, because they're probably not going to be taught in such a way that says, for some people in Judeo-Christian religion, these are the 10 Commandments. Not going to be, these are universal for all, right? That's a big, to Jonathan's point about age-appropriate nuance. I'm not an educator, but I don't know how to explain that to a kindergartner. Maybe a top upper high school, whatever, potentially. But how do you get the nuance across?
but I mean, that's my point. Simply by posting it in the classroom, you don't even have to teach it. You're telling kids this is
it.
This
Right.
is it. And so for the kids who do not believe in that particular religion, are they in an environment where they are experiencing freedom of religion? I don't think so. I mean, I just don't think that they are, because it's imposed on them that if the school puts it up, it's like a policeman. If a policeman says so, then it's so, right? I mean, for kids, that's what we teach them.
Well, what if we go to the Christmas issue? My wife and I do not agree on this particular issue that she is teaching, and it bothered her that every year they would have Christmas vacation.
Right.
And she was pleased when they changed it to winter vacation.
Right.
I felt sort of the opposite, in the same way that it's a country that was built on Judeo-Christian values. That's part of the foundational fabric and bedrock. So I'm mixing my metaphors of the culture. And I don't mind. In fact, I think it's a positive thing that there's an awareness that these values are the ones that contributed to the foundational values of the country. So I can understand the sensitivity to identifying Christmas as a national holiday, but I don't agree with the objection to it, because I think that it serves us. It reminds us of values that are incorporated in our culture by design, and that are just part of our national identity and awareness.
I hear you. I'm going to take that one step further and see what the others think. When I say happy holidays, it is not because I'm bashing Christmas. It is not because I am anti-Christmas. It is because I recognize that not everybody celebrates Christmas.
Yeah.
And so I think that argument has kind of gotten flipped upside down. And so for those people who prefer happy holidays, it's, well, you're tarnishing Christmas.
No, and I think that's right, because when somebody says to you Merry Christmas, they're only wishing you a Happy Christmas. Now, during the Christmas break or winter break, there are other holidays as well. So when somebody says Merry Christmas, I'm Jewish. I'm like, okay, I guess so. But when they say Happy Holidays, it feels more inclusive, right?
Right.
Now, I'm not going to make a big deal about it. I don't get offended if somebody says Merry Christmas, and like it doesn't matter. But it feels like Happy Holidays is more inclusive. Then it gets to this political woke, whatever, which company is going to allow their employees at, whether it's Bloomingdale says Merry Christmas, but Starbucks it's Happy Holidays, and all that. Like it becomes such a thing, and then click it 3 times, and now it's the right versus the left, and it's like like I don't think anybody ever wished me Merry Christmas in a hateful way. Like you don't overthink that, right? But like now we've changed the way we address the holidays a little bit.
Well, I think so much of this is to Jonathan's point, is the bedrock of our society, and good intentions to treat morality. It's not like the intentions. Okay, well, yes and no. I don't believe the crux of it is to hurt people. I think the crux of it is to teach. I think the intention behind it is to teach what is viewed by the decision makers as morality. And you have to almost wonder, is this a challenge because we have because it's the United States Constitution instead of the state constitution? So if the Constitution, if it were left to the states, would this be a completely different issue? Would it not be as divisive of an issue? I don't know. I'm just asking the question because I presume that right now in the communities where this is taking place, the majority of the people would probably agree with some of these decisions, but it's because we're using standards that we're using for the entire United States to make decisions for these for the states. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I would say, the school system is largely federally funded, right? So it's delivered on the local level, but the
Yes.
funding is federal. So the question is, where's your tax dollars going to? And what is
Right.
it
And if I
supporting?
would, my assumption is, and these are all assumptions, so you can do, what to do with them. But my assumption is if you were to ask people in that community if they could afford to send their kids to a school that wasn't publicly funded by the government, but that they could still send their kid for free, that they would probably choose to send their kid to a school that matched their belief system. That is my assumption. That's not the system we have, but that's my assumption, is that's what they seem to be wanting to do, is to create a school that fits a certain belief that is more of a private school belief, yet using federally funded dollars to do that.
Now you've opened up the whole charter school debate.
Oh, I know.
There you go.
Right, what was it? The voucher program or whatever.
The voucher program.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about this, I think about the school district here and the school board members who were elected, and the first thing they wanted to do was send Bibles home with all the kids. And, I don't know I don't know if the community were polled, like what kind of support they would get from that. But to me, that is the absolute opposite of separation of church and state.
I totally agree with you, Melissa. I totally agree with you.
Which I think is different from I don't know how exactly it's different, but I do think it's different from posting the 10 Commandments. Not that I'm in favor of that either, but I'm just saying, but I do think that's different. And I just wonder, when did we decide that the separation of church and state thing was not going to be a thing anymore?
Well,
Because
that's
But it's never been a
interesting.
thing. That's what I'm saying. It's on our currency. It's in
Right,
our pledge of
yeah.
allegiance. It's never really been a thing.
No, and it was actually formalized. I meant to look up an article on this, and I just neglected to do it. But if I remember correctly, the concept was articulated by Jefferson,
Mhm.
but it never
Yes.
really worked its way formally into law until I think it was 1947.
Mhm.
So it's not quite as established as people make it out to be. And that we still do have it on the currency that's been challenged a few times.
Right,
Indicates
right.
that there isn't an intrinsic contradiction between an acknowledgement of God and the federal government.
But I think on so many of these belief systems, the intention behind it isn't evil and bad. It's just what does that, the execution of it and the what does that mean about this, and what is that word, what's the precedent we're setting? Like, having thou shall not kill, that's that's a pretty good thing. We don't want people killing. That's bad, right? Killing's bad.
Right, but there are other ways to teach that
I
concept.
agree.
It's against the law, like,
But that has
and we do.
it's got a totally different.
Yeah, it's a moral principle as opposed to a legal principle.
Yes.
That's something
Exactly,
that's
Yes.
entrenched in human society back to the beginnings of human civilization. It carries a certain connotation that you don't get otherwise. And it's like all of the 12-step programs. They all start with acknowledge that there's something greater than yourself. And that
Yeah.
message is something I think we can all benefit from, regardless of our particular religious affiliations or beliefs.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
so to your point about that, they also changed it in the 12-step programs, is very much a Christian program, but they've changed it from God to higher power. So
Yeah.
whatever that higher power is for you,
God, how you define it. Yeah.
right? And I think that's a significant point.
Huge.
Well, and if you stay with that theme, when you read, a lot of the leadership books and all those things, many of them are based in Judeo-Christian principles. However, when it moves into the corporate side, now we use terms that are a little more neutral, beliefs, right? Like, or as opposed to, quoting the Bible or something, because we typically deem it inappropriate for a large company to teach, of one sect, as opposed to, a belief or a set of standards or whatever.
Well, I mean,
To kind of
every
water it
company's
down a
got,
bit.
well, not every company, but they've got their values, their corporate values. This is
Yeah,
what we stand
right.
for. And I think that's essentially in the Christian world what the 10 Commandments are. These are our values.
Yeah,
And the problem is as a country as diverse as we are, to agree on a set of values when we can't agree on anything is a challenge. And yet parents often want to offload some of that the burden of teaching values and morality to the schools, to their religious institutions, because it feels like such an overwhelming thing to carry as a parent in a society like ours. So you can understand wanting some support there to bolster up the values you stand for, but as a nation, we have a very hard time having conversation about what do we agree on, because we immediately
Well, we've
go
seen-
there, I
we-
don't agree.
I'm glad you circled
you've
back
seen
to that, because I have a colleague who he gets apoplectic about schools should be teaching ethics, and why aren't they? And while I agree wholeheartedly they should be teaching ethics, I think it's pretty obvious why they aren't, for exactly the reason that you're saying, Kimberly. We just can't agree
Right.
on what is ethics, what are ethics, what are these values, and that's where I see the value of the 10 Commandments. It conceptualizes this idea that there are certain principles that are universal. And whether I believe literally in the doctrine that from which these emerged society has developed because, I mean, what did Jefferson say in the Declaration, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. There have to be certain foundational beliefs that we can at least reference as helping us to orient ourselves morally, ethically.
Well,
But
and it could
universal
be
is-
the
but
fact that
uni-
we're
you-
getting
you-
away from any kind of central, and I don't subscribe to a lot of things, so, but it could be the fact that we don't have those anchors that is causing a lot of the unraveling amongst us, because we can't agree, so we're like deer in the headlights. We don't,
Well-
have anything we subscribe to.
Yeah, and I would add two things to that. One is, universal is relevant, right? So even the Ten Commandments, don't covet your neighbor's wife, and then all of a sudden, well, there's a polyamorous community. You go Google that. Like, oh, okay, well, that's not coveting. That's like, oh, now is that a loophole, or is that like, okay, so are they violating it? No, but seriously,
Or is it adultery when it's all consensual, right?
right, that's a whole other thing. And then, so that's one piece is define universal among everybody that looks like me and acts like me, then believes like me.
Right.
Sure. But
Right.
like, okay. And then the other thing is, I want to push on Giannis a little bit on, teaching ethics is good, but isn't teaching critical thinking better?
Yes.
'Cause when you teach ethics, you impose, these are the 10 things, and everybody goes, yes, instead of saying, well, why? Like, okay, do you think it's good to kill people? Are there better ways to resolve conflict than to get a hammer and bash your head in? Yeah, probably. Okay, well, let's think about that. Or why did these things come to be? Or why did, you don't steal other people's stuff or whatever they are. I think critical thinking is less of a hot potato. Nobody says, no, I don't want my kid to be unable to be a critical thinker.
Well, it is actually, but critical thinking
Maybe
partnered with empathy and compassion, where you can
Yeah.
marry those three, right? So it's not, one or the other, but
you
it's
can critical think your way to anything
But you can-
if you're
Yes, that's right.
adept enough.
That's right. You can justify anything.
But also,
well, I can say
it's
that
like-
the empathy is optional with critical thinking. You could be truly
Right,
analytical
exactly.
without having.
But
the
I'm
absence of
suggesting
empathy.
that we partner those things.
I mean, utilitarianism is built on analysis, and yet it's entirely amoral. It's been rejected by most of the philosophical community as a I mean, there's a certain utility in it, but it just doesn't get you all the way there by any means. Yeah, Melissa.
I was just gonna say, also just like in if we talk about organizational values, and you've got the poster on the wall, and these are our values, and this is our mission, and this is our vision. That means nothing if the culture doesn't support it.
Yes.
And I think the same about education. Those commandments on the wall mean nothing if that's not what the kids see and feel, and what modeling they get from the
That's
people
right.
around them. And I was thinking, Jonathan, about your example of Dan Ariely, whom is one of my big heroes, but we will leave that for another show. But he did a lot of other studies, and it wasn't just the Ten Commandments that made people more honest and less likely to cheat. He also did a study where he put people in a light room and a darkly lit room, and the people in the darkly lit room were much more likely to cheat. He did another study with kindergartners, where I think it was kindergartners or toddlers, and he primed them with pictures of people together. And actually, they weren't even people; they were like wooden figures. And the kids that saw the pictures of the wooden figures together, insinuating that we're a community, that we help each other. Someone walked in the room and dropped a box of pencils. The kids that saw the figures together were much more likely to stop and help. So, I mean, there's all kinds of psychology that would suggest that we can prime people to do pretty much whatever we want them to do. But it is whatever those values are, they have to be baked into the culture, or they're just words on a piece of paper.
And there's a difference between the values on the wall and the applied. I mean, I remember reading years ago when Enron crashed, here's the value statement, and it didn't say lie, cheat, and steal. It was awesome. It could have been like every company would be like, sign up for that. Well, what was really going on day to day, and how did that happen, and how did that erode? And You know, how did that become the norm versus, you know, save the world, clean energy, and whatever their values claim to be versus what was actually happening?
Absolutely.
Well, and we see that all the time in our religions too,
Yeah.
where people say one thing and then their behavior is completely the opposite. So, yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite example is the person in the car who's demonstrating road rage and giving somebody the finger and honking on the horn, and they pass by and they've got the fish on the back of the car. And I'm like, what? What? Like, okay. But then they're going to go to church and they're going to make it all better. And that's what I mean by, is it a live, and Peter, to your point, is it a lived value? Is it an applied value? Or is it what we aspire to be? And I will acquiesce that we have aspiring values that we don't always make it to, and I'm one of those people too, right? So,
It's pretty much everybody.
yeah.
It's the human experience, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, according to Jewish tradition, the Second Temple was destroyed in part because the people were meticulous in the letter of the law, but neglectful of the spirit of the law.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that got God a lot more upset than outright violation.
Yeah.
Because now I can walk around patting myself on the back for how holy I am and how pious I am and how righteous I am when I've completely missed the point.
Right.
And, you know, I agree completely with you, Melissa, that we have to find ways of inculcating these values in ourselves and in our culture. But then the point that you raised earlier, Kimberly, is we have to agree on them first.
Right.
Well, but stay there a second, Giannis. And if that's your belief, which is great, then the next question is, whose responsibility is it? Is it parents' responsibility? Is it the school's responsibility? Is it who owns that, right? To instill those beliefs.
What's that?
As a society, I think as a society, we own it, right? I don't think, and I think that's also a problem, is that we divorce ourselves of, you know, from taking any responsibility for people that we disagree is less than, or that they're not like us or whatever, and we only take care of the people that we think are like us. But as a society, collectively, if we've agreed to live in a society, we have a responsibility to our society.
I mean, it should be the parents' responsibility first. It should be the school's responsibility in a more general sense. And it should be the responsibility of society as a whole, because I mean, that's what a society is. I just saw this phrase this week, roommate parenting. Parents who,
what does that mean?
They don't really want to be bothered parenting.
Oh.
So essentially they're minimalist in their parenting. They're letting the kids, you're giving the kids the minimum. They're not really interested in getting calls from the teachers or going to teacher meetings. And as soon as the oldest kid is old enough, they're pawning off responsibilities for the younger kids on the older kids. I mean, it's pretty disturbing.
The irony is that so many of the world religions actually have very similar values. The challenge is that nobody's living them. So, right. It's not that we don't all have a sense of our values. It's just nobody's living the values. And so,
you know, I'm going to go back. We should actually do a show on book banning, because I'm going to go back to it now, Giannis, for a second. There was a story it was last year sometime, and there was a picture book, and it was an award-winning picture book, and it was about a child who had two moms. And again, it's a picture book. And it wasn't promoting gay marriage. It wasn't promoting, it was a story about a little boy who had to teach his peers tell his peers why he had two moms and how he did that and how the moms helped. And so there was nothing untoward about that, but there was a group of women in that school who fought very hard to get that book banned, among others. And there was a gay mom who came to the school and said, wait a minute, tell me what's wrong with this book, because if by taking that book off the shelf, what you're saying to kids is that my life is wrong. My lifestyle is wrong. And you're not just saying that to the kids, the rest of the school, but you're specifically saying that to my child. Because the way it all came out was the mother told the child to go look for this book, and the kid asked the librarian, and then it all unraveled from there. So, I mean, I guess my point is, if we are going to let the schools decide they're going to teach values to the kids, that's a slippery slope too, because that mother had a very strong opinion that that book should not be on the shelf. And then here's another person who's living her life and not bothering anybody, and she has a very strong opinion that that's her value. And so who's right? And ultimately, who loses? Because in that situation, I think the kids lose.
Well, you're into something that is a very emotional issue. I mean, 30 years ago, there would never have been a conversation like that.
Right.
Some people see that as progress, and some people don't. I think there's a big distinction between removing a book from a library and not including a book in a curriculum.
Huge difference.
I mean, I was livid when, I taught in an Orthodox Jewish school, and I was livid when a parent made a fuss about teaching 1984 because there was a sex scene in it. And
or Diary of Anne Frank. Diary of Anne Frank was removed because of the graphic sexual content in it. Are you kidding me?
Right.
Well, but that I think is, yeah, but then on the other hand, I wouldn't particularly want the color purple taught in my high school. So that's my value judgment. Am I right? Am I wrong? Can I defend myself? I think I can. But I think the job of the school is to try to find a kind of balanced path of things that are not objectively objectionable, knowing that we're never going to make everybody happy, but at the same time trying to avoid hot button issues and topics and titles.
Well, Giannis, and I'm going to push back on that for a minute, because that is not a hot button issue for that family. That is not a hot button issue for the kids. The specific example that I use, for the kids that are friends with that boy, for the kids that are on his baseball team, and that is not a hot button issue for them. That is life for them. And unless they're living, unless they're going out and shooting people or stealing or whatever, right? Then by saying we can't put this picture book in our school library, it's saying that life is wrong. And I do not believe that we have the right to do that.
That's the challenge, though, Melissa, because we talked about how federally funded dollars are being invested or run our schools, right? But if you look at who the school boards are people are intentionally running for school boards that have a very specific ideological agenda. And it's that agenda that's being pushed through regardless of how the schools are funded. And so decisions for the schools are being made by school boards that have agendas versus what is right from a national values perspective.
Yep, you're right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't have any great confidence in school boards, generally speaking. I don't have these days it's hard to have confidence in anybody, because that's part of our problem.
But if we go back
that's the trust issue.
Well, it's trusting judgment, and it's trusting competence.
If we go back to what both Peter and Kimberly, what you both said about teaching critical thinking, how can you teach kids critical thinking if you don't teach them to seek out a variety of perspectives? Critical thinking is all about gather the information and see how they compare and see which ones match and see which one makes sense to you. Critical thinking is not, here's the book, read it. This is it.
But do you think really most parents want to teach critical thinking? I mean,
Well-
I think we like to think of it as the outcome. We want people to have critical thinkers, but we don't want our kids critically thinking and disagreeing with me and disagreeing with the values I'm teaching them and disagreeing with what they're learning in their in their own faith. We don't want that. Yeah, we want
gotcha on
critical
that.
thinkers, but
That's-
but not really.
Okay, but if we want schools to teach critical thinking, then we cannot give them one book, one
I
tool,
totally
one-
agree. I totally agree. But
It's impossible.
I think I mean, if you get down to the heart of it, I don't think a lot of people really do want their kids to be critical thinkers. I think if you really get down to the heart of it.
Oh, that makes me so sad.
But don't you think
I don't
that's-
know about that. I think there's a difference between a 2-year-old asking why 39 times in a row, and eventually you say, because I said so, right? Like that's the good parent to the bad parent is how many whys till I said so. But I think, encouraging kids to critically think.
Oh, I think it's
is an
incredibly
obligation
important.
of a parent.
But I think it's not true that if you really get to the truth, the root truth, parents don't want their kids to critically think beyond what they want their kids to think.
Well, and so
I think that's what's real.
a lot of adults don't critically think, and so if my kid's learning to
right.
think more deeply than I am, I'm going to feel threatened by that.
Yeah.
I remember I taught a unit, I taught 4th grade, Jonathan. You'll be happy to know that I taught the 10-year-olds, so you wouldn't have to.
My hat is off to you.
But we did a unit where I gave them a topic and they had to put what their position on that topic was, and all the kids had different topics. And then the assignment was to assume the opposite position.
Right.
And write an argument for the opposite position. And so to do that, they had to go to the library and find a resource that gave them information supporting that other, because it wasn't like.
Right,
really-
but that's the standard operating system for debate club is not that kids that think X are on this team and things Y. You randomly get the subject, be pro-life, be pro whatever, death penalty, whatever it is. It's always hot button topics, and it's your ability to make your case and articulate it is what debate is teaching you, not that this is right and this is wrong.
Yeah, but the foundation for that is for kids to be able to go find resources to find out what would support the other opinion, like the alternate opinion of that. And so I think if my school library was only filled with books that supported one particular ideology, well, we can't do that. We can't teach kids how to find resources that would help them seek out a different perspective.
But don't you think nowadays, if you were to teach that same lesson at that age group, you would have parents that would be fighting back?
Oh, absolutely. And I had parents then that were fighting back, and that was 100 years ago. But here's the thing. And they didn't come to me, they went to my principal.
Right, right.
We did have a sit down, and I explained, like, this is the point of this assignment is not to turn your kid's opinion around. The point of the assignment is this, right? And then once they understood that the point of the assignment was to help them find resources to explore different opinions on topics, then the parents backed down, and then they were okay.
I'm surprised they backed down because I think fear is such a driver. I think it's all fear.
Well, it was
Oh,
100
it's
years ago,
fear-based.
so today they probably wouldn't. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, listen, now that we've completely resolved this issue and solved all the problems,
Exactly.
I think this is a good place to stop.
As we're apt to do. Yeah. Okay.
And for those, if you have time to stick around for the second segment, I hope you will. For those of you who are watching and would like to hear that second segment, that's available to paid subscribers. And for the rest of you, thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. If you have a topic that you'd like us to take up for a further future episode, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information. If it's compelling, we will take it up. For now, thank you very much, Kimberly Davis, Melissa Hughes, Peter Winick. Always a pleasure. And for in the audience, always encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.